Elena's knees buckled the moment the drums stopped. 1 second she was standing at the edge of the ceremony grounds, trying to make herself small in a crowd that had never wanted her there. The next second the torches blurred into streaks of orange light, the chanting of the crowd turned into a distant roar inside her ears, and the ground tilted so violently that she thought the earth itself had cracked open beneath her feet. She did not remember falling, she only remembered arms. Strong arms, closing around her before her body ever touched the grass. A low sound rumbled through the chest she landed against. Not quite a growl, and not quite a word. Something older than language. Something that made every hair on her arms rise, even as darkness swallowed her vision. 3 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Elena Voss had walked to the ceremony grounds the same way she walked everywhere in Ashgrove territory, with her head down and her steps quiet. She was an Omega with no pack standing, no parents to speak for her, and no reason to expect the mating ceremony to change anything about her life. She had only come because attendance was required. Every unmated wolf under the age of 30 had to stand on the grounds while the pack elders called names, hoping the ancient bond would spark between two strangers and mark them for life. It rarely happened. Most wolves left the ceremony exactly as unmatched as they arrived, and Elena had always assumed she would be one of them, every single year, for the rest of her life. She had not slept properly in 4 days. Her mother's cough had grown worse, deep and rattling, the kind of cough that kept Elena awake in the small hours listening for it to stop. During the day she worked at the healer's tent, grinding herbs and boiling water, and doing anything she could to earn enough coin for medicine that never seemed to work fast enough. By the time the sun set on ceremony night, her body was running on nothing but nerves and duty. She stood near the back of the crowd, arms wrapped around herself, watching wolves twice her rank move confidently toward the center of the grounds. Firelight danced across painted banners, bearing the crest of the Ashgrove pack, a silver wolf howling beneath a crown of stars. Somewhere near the front, close enough to the great stone platform that his presence seemed to bend the air around him, stood the reason half the territory had shown up early enough to claim good seats. King Damien Ashgrove rarely attended the ceremony in person. As Alpha King of the Northern Territories, he had matters far more pressing than watching unmated pups try their luck at fate. But this year, he stood at the platform's edge, arms crossed, dark eyes scanning the crowd with the restless patience of a man, waiting for something he could not name. Elena had only glimpsed him once before, from a great distance, and even then his presence had struck her like a physical weight. Up close, even at this distance, she could feel something pulling at her chest, though she told herself it was only nerves. She was too tired to wonder why. The elders began calling names. Pairs were announced, examined for the telltale shiver of recognition that marked a true bond, and sent to the side when nothing happened. Hour after hour dragged past. Elena's vision blurred more with every passing name, the exhaustion in her body finally catching up with her all at once, the way debts always did. When her name was finally called, she barely heard it. She stumbled forward on legs that no longer felt like her own, aware of eyes on her, aware that people were whispering the way they always whispered when an Omega with no family walked toward the platform. She was paired with a beta from a neighboring farm, a decent enough man who looked as unimpressed by the pairing as she felt. Nothing happened between them. No spark, no shiver, no recognition. The elder waved them apart with a tired hand and called the next names. Relief and disappointment tangled together inside her, and it was that exact moment, standing at the edge of the platform with the crowd's attention already moving past her, that her body simply gave out. The dizziness came first, a wave of heat and cold at once. Then the world tilted. Then there was nothing beneath her feet at all, only the terrifying sensation of falling, with no way to stop it. And then the arms. She would spend the rest of her life trying to describe what happened in the half-second before she lost consciousness completely, and she would never quite manage it. It was not simply that someone had caught her. It was that something inside her chest recognized the person catching her. The way a key recognizes the shape of its lock. The way thunder always follows lightning. A pulse of warmth spread beneath her skin, radiating out from wherever his hands touched her. And for one impossible instant, her exhaustion did not matter at all. Because something in her had just found what it had apparently been looking for her whole life without knowing it. She heard a sound above her, a low intake of breath that did not belong to a stranger reacting to a fainting girl. It belonged to someone whose entire world had just shifted on its axis. Then the darkness took her completely, and she knew nothing more. The crowd around the platform had gone silent, in a way that ceremony crowds never went silent, not even during the most dramatic pairings. Whispers rippled outward in every direction, faster than fire through dry grass. People who had been laughing moments before now stood frozen, staring at the sight of their king on one knee in the dirt, an unconscious Omega cradled against his chest, as though she weighed nothing at all, as though the entire ceremony had simply stopped existing around the two of them. Nobody moved to help. Nobody dared to interrupt whatever was happening. Damien Ashgrove did not seem to notice the silence, or the stares, or the elders who had gone pale near the platform steps. His entire focus had narrowed to the woman in his arms, to the scent rising from her skin that had struck him like a blow the second she came close enough to catch. He had spent 32 years being told that the fated bond was a rare and precious thing, something most alphas never experienced even once in a long life. He had stopped believing in it, somewhere around his 20th birthday, after years of meeting potential matches arranged by his council, with no spark, no recognition, nothing but polite disappointment on both sides. He had certainly never expected to find it in an Omega he had never met, standing at the very edge of the crowd, collapsing into his arms, as if pulled there by something far older and far more powerful than coincidence. Her face was pale, damp with effort, strands of dark hair sticking to her forehead. Up close he could see the exhaustion carved into her features, the thinness of a woman who had not eaten properly in days, the fragile stillness of someone who had pushed her body far past its limits. None of it dimmed the pull he felt toward her. If anything, it sharpened into something close to alarm, a fierce and immediate need to make sure she was safe, warm, cared for. His wolf, usually a quiet and disciplined presence beneath the surface of his thoughts, was roaring inside him with a single word, over and over, impossible to ignore. Mine. He looked up and found Grace, one of the healer's assistants, pushing through the stunned crowd with a healer's bag already in hand. Word traveled fast in a pack this size, and someone had clearly run for help the moment Elena hit the ground. She's burning up, Grace said, kneeling beside them and pressing the back of her hand to Elena's forehead. Exhaustion, most likely. Maybe worse. When did she last eat a proper meal? Damien did not have an answer, and the fact that he did not have an answer bothered him more than he expected. He barely knew this woman's name. He knew nothing about her life, her family, her circumstances, and yet the thought of her collapsing from hunger and exhaustion, while his own kitchens overflowed with more food than his household could ever eat, sent a hot spike of something close to anger through his chest. She comes to the palace, he said. It was not a request, and nobody in the crowd was foolish enough to treat it like one. Now. Grace hesitated, only long enough to glance at the elders, who offered no objection, before nodding and helping arrange Elena more securely in Damien's arms. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, cradling her against his chest, as though she were made of something far more fragile than she actually was, and turned toward the path leading up to the palace, without another word to the stunned crowd behind him. Whispers followed him the entire way, growing louder the farther he walked, but he heard none of them. His attention remained fixed entirely on the woman in his arms, on the way her breathing had begun to steady slightly against his chest, on the strange and undeniable certainty settling into his bones that his life had just changed in a way he could never undo. Behind him, near the platform, a man named Nathan Cole watched the king's retreating back with narrowed eyes and a stillness that did not match the shock rippling through everyone else around him. Nathan was Damien's cousin, third in line to lead the pack council, and for years he had quietly assumed that his own position would only grow stronger as Damien remained unmated, distracted by the endless duties of ruling alone. A fated mate changed everything. A fated mate meant an heir. A fated mate meant Nathan's careful plans, built slowly over years of patient waiting, might crumble to nothing in the space of a single ceremony night. He said nothing to the wolves around him, offered no visible reaction beyond the faint tightening of his jaw, and turned to walk back toward the estate houses at the edge of the territory, already thinking, already calculating, already deciding that this unexpected turn of events would need to be handled very carefully indeed. Inside the palace, servants scrambled to prepare a chamber the moment word reached them of what had happened at the ceremony grounds. Fresh sheets were pulled tight across the bed in the king's private wing. Water was set to boil, and Grace hurried alongside Damien the entire way, monitoring Elena's pulse, her breathing, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "She'll live," Grace said finally, once Elena had been settled beneath warm blankets in the grand bedroom that had never once, in all the years Grace had served here, housed a guest. She needs rest, food, and time. Whatever exhausted her body this badly did not happen in a single day. Damien stood at the edge of the bed for a long moment, watching Elena's chest rise and fall, watching the way her fingers curled slightly into the blankets even in sleep. He did not know her name yet. He did not know anything about the life that had led her to collapse at the edge of a ceremony crowd rather than at its center. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his chest and refused to move, that whatever answers waited for him when she woke would matter more than anything else happening in his kingdom. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down to wait, ignoring the concerned looks from the servants who lingered near the doorway, ignoring the growing whispers already spreading through every corner of the palace. Somewhere beyond these walls, a council would be gathering, questions would be forming, and a cousin with careful ambitions would already be searching for a way to turn tonight's events to his own advantage. None of it mattered yet. For now there was only the quiet room, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the strange, unshakable pull, drawing him toward a stranger whose name he did not even know, but whose place in his life had already been decided by something far older and far stronger than either of them. Elena remained unconscious through the night, unaware of the king keeping watch beside her, unaware of the storm already gathering around the bond neither of them had asked for, unaware that when she opened her eyes again, nothing about her life would ever be simple again. Elena woke to the feeling of silk against her skin, and her first thought was that she must still be dreaming, because nothing in her life had ever felt this soft. Her second thought, arriving a heartbeat later with far more force, was raw panic. She did not recognize the ceiling above her, carved with patterns of climbing vines and stars she had never seen in any building in the territory. She did not recognize the heavy curtains framing tall windows, or the fireplace crackling low and steady across the room, or the scent of pine and something darker, something powerful, clinging to the sheets around her. Her heart began to slam against her ribs before her mind had even finished cataloging the details, some deep animal instinct screaming that she was not safe, that she did not belong here, that something had gone terribly wrong. She sat up too fast, and the room spun. "Careful," said a voice near the door, gentle but firm. "You have been asleep for almost a full day. Your body needs a moment before you move like that." Elena's head snapped toward the sound, and she found a young woman standing near the entrance, a tray balanced in her hands, dressed in the simple gray uniform of palace staff. The woman's eyes were kind, but there was something careful in the way she held herself, something that told Elena this was not an ordinary morning in an ordinary house. "Where am I?" Elena managed, her voice rough from disuse. "You are in the king's private wing," the woman said, setting the tray down on a small table near the bed. "My name is Grace. I have been looking after you since you were brought here." The words did not make sense at first. Elena turned them over slowly, waiting for them to click into place, waiting for the explanation that would make this all sound reasonable, instead of impossible. The king's private wing. Brought here. None of it fit into any version of her life that made sense. Brought here by who? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, a memory surfacing from the edges of unconsciousness, strong arms, and a low sound like a growl, and a warmth spreading beneath her skin that had felt like nothing she had ever experienced before. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking whether someone might arrive to answer the question for her. I think it would be better if he explained that part himself. As if summoned by the words themselves, the door opened again, and Elena's breath caught somewhere in the back of her throat. She recognized him instantly, even though she had only glimpsed him once before across a crowded ceremony ground. He was taller up close than she had realized, broad-shouldered, dressed now in simple dark clothing rather than the formal robes he had worn the previous night. His eyes found hers immediately, and something passed between them, quick and electric, a recognition that made no sense, given they had never actually spoken a single word to each other before this moment. "You're awake," he said, and his voice carried a warmth Elena had not expected from a man whose reputation, even among people who had never met him, spoke of discipline and unyielding authority. "How do you feel?" "Confused," Elena said honestly, pulling the blanket a little tighter around herself, painfully aware of how vulnerable she must look, sitting in a stranger's bed in clothes that were not her own. "Someone needs to tell me what happened. All of it, right now." Damien crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something he did not want to frighten away, and settled into the chair beside the bed, the same chair he had occupied through most of the previous night. Grace quietly excused herself, closing the door behind her with a soft click, leaving the two of them alone in the firelit room. "My name is Damien Ashgrove," he said. "I am the Alpha King of this territory. Last night, at the mating ceremony, you collapsed. I caught you before you hit the ground." "I remember that part," Elena said carefully. "What I don't understand is why I woke up in what appears to be your bedroom, wearing clothes I did not put on myself, with no memory of agreeing to any of this." "You were unconscious," Damien said. "Grace changed your clothes and cared for you through the night. Nothing happened that you would need to be ashamed of or afraid of. I want to be clear about that immediately." Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, and found none, only a strange kind of earnestness that unsettled her more than dishonesty would have. "That still doesn't explain why I am here at all. Why not simply send me home, or to the healer's tent, or anywhere that wasn't the private chambers of the king?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working slightly as though he were choosing his next words with great care. "Because the moment you fell into my arms, something happened that I have spent my entire adult life being told would probably never happen to me at all. My wolf recognized your scent the way a fated mate is recognized. I believe you are my mate, Elena." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward in every direction, and Elena felt something in her chest twist painfully tight. "That's not possible," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "I am nobody. I have no pack standing, no family name worth mentioning, nothing that would make sense of a king choosing me for anything, let alone something as significant as a mate bond." "The bond does not choose based on standing or family name," Damien said. "It chooses based on something far older than politics." "I did not decide this, Elena, neither did you. It simply is." "How do you even know my name?" Elena asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. Some small, useless detail to grab onto in the middle of a conversation that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own life. "The elders called it at the ceremony, right before you collapsed," Damien said. "I have not stopped thinking about it since." Elena pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady the spinning sensation that had nothing to do with exhaustion anymore, and everything to do with the impossible situation she had woken up into. Her mother was sick at home. Her mother needed her. Needed the coin from her work at the healer's tent. Needed someone to check on her cough every few hours, and make sure the fever did not spike in the night. And instead Elena was sitting in a palace, being told by a king she had never spoken to before, that some ancient, mystical bond had decided her entire future, without ever asking her opinion on the matter. "I need to go home," she said. "My mother is ill. She needs me. Whatever this bond is, whatever you believe it means, I cannot simply abandon her because fate apparently has other plans for me." Something shifted in Damien's expression at the mention of her mother's illness, a flicker of concern that seemed entirely genuine. "Tell me what is wrong with her." Elena hesitated, unused to anyone outside the healer's tent, asking about her mother's condition with anything more than polite disinterest. "A cough that will not clear. It has gotten worse over the past several weeks. I have been trying different remedies, but nothing seems to help for long, and the medicine that might actually work costs more than I can earn in a month. I will have my personal healer examine her today," Damien said, and there was no hesitation in his voice at all, no calculation, only immediate decision. "Whatever medicine she requires, it will be provided. You do not need to worry about the cost." Elena stared at him, thrown off balance by the sudden and unconditional generosity of the offer. "Why would you do that?" "Because you are my mate," Damien said simply, "and because no one under my protection should suffer for lack of medicine, while my own stores overflow with more than my household could ever use. I would have made the same offer regardless of the bond, if I had known sooner." Something in his tone made Elena believe him, and that belief unsettled her almost as much as the bond itself. She had spent her entire life learning not to trust easy kindness, not to expect anything from people with power and standing, because experience had taught her that such people rarely extended themselves for someone like her without expecting something in return. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "In exchange for the healer, for the medicine, for all of this, what is the price?" Damien's expression shifted into something that looked almost like hurt, quickly masked, but not quickly enough for Elena to miss it entirely. "There is no price, Elena. I am not offering to help your mother as a bargaining tool. I am offering because it is the right thing to do, and because the thought of you suffering while help was available to me is not something I am willing to accept." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, followed almost immediately by the entrance of a woman Elena did not recognize, dressed in fine clothing that marked her as someone of considerable standing within the palace. Her eyes swept over Elena with an expression of open disdain before settling on Damien with something closer to concern. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice tight with barely controlled displeasure. "The council has gathered. They are demanding an explanation for what happened last night, and I must say, I share their confusion. An Omega with no pack standing, no family history worth mentioning, suddenly declared your fated mate in front of the entire territory. Surely you understand how this looks." "This is Countess Miriam Hale," Damien said to Elena, his tone cooling noticeably as he addressed the woman standing in the doorway. "She serves on my council. Miriam, this is Elena Voss, my mate. I would appreciate it if you addressed her with the respect that title deserves." Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line, but she offered a shallow, insincere bow in Elena's direction. "Of course, Your Majesty. I only meant to express the council's concerns, which I am sure you understand are entirely reasonable given the circumstances." "The council's concerns can wait until I have had the chance to properly care for my mate," Damien said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "Tell them I will address their questions this evening, not before." Miriam's eyes flicked once more toward Elena, cold and assessing, before she offered another shallow bow and withdrew from the room, closing the door behind her with far more force than necessary. Elena watched the exchange with a growing sense of dread settling into her stomach. If this was the reaction from someone within the palace itself, someone who presumably knew Damien well enough to speak to him so directly, she could only imagine what awaited her from the rest of the court, the rest of the territory, all of whom would soon learn that a penniless Omega had somehow been chosen as their king's fated mate. "That will not be the last time you encounter that kind of reaction," Damien said quietly, watching her face. "I will not pretend otherwise. There will be people in this court who resent the bond, who question your worthiness, who may even try to make your life here difficult. I cannot promise you an easy path, Elena, but I can promise you that I will stand beside you through all of it, and that anyone who tries to harm you will answer directly to me." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of everything pressing down at once, the exhaustion, the confusion, the strange and undeniable pull she felt toward this man she barely knew, and the growing certainty that whatever life she had imagined for herself before last night no longer existed at all. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to understand what any of this means. Time to see my mother. Time to figure out who I even am in the middle of all this. Can you give me that much at least?" "I can give you whatever you need," Damien said. "But I will not lie to you and pretend the bond is not real, or that I do not feel it as strongly as you clearly feel something as well, whether you are ready to name it yet or not." Elena did not answer, because she did not trust herself to speak past the tightness in her throat, past the strange mixture of fear and recognition, and something else entirely that she refused to examine too closely. Outside the window, the sun was climbing higher over the palace grounds, and somewhere beyond the walls of this room, a council was gathering, a cousin was scheming, and an entire territory was already whispering about the Omega who had collapsed into the Alpha King's arms and woken up with her whole future rewritten in a single, impossible night. The knife missed Elena's throat by less than an inch. She felt the wind of it pass her cheek before she understood what was happening, before her mind caught up with the sight of a blade embedded in the wooden doorframe just beside her head, still quivering from the force of the throw. For one frozen second, the hallway around her seemed to stop entirely, the torches flickering, the servants nearby going utterly silent, and then chaos erupted all at once. Guards poured into the corridor from both directions, swords drawn, shouting orders Elena could barely process through the ringing in her ears. Someone grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her back against the wall, away from the doorway, and it took her several long seconds to realize the hands belonged to Damien, who had appeared from nowhere with an expression of such controlled fury that Elena felt a fresh wave of fear simply looking at his face. This had happened only 4 days after she woke in his bed, and in those 4 days Elena had learned more about palace life than she had ever wanted to know. The first 2 days had passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. Damien's personal healer had visited Elena's mother exactly as promised, arriving with medicine far more potent than anything Elena could have ever afforded on her own. Within a day, her mother's cough had already begun to ease, and the relief Elena felt at watching her mother breathe easier for the first time in weeks had briefly outweighed every other fear crowding her mind. But relief had not lasted long. Elena had refused to move into the palace permanently, insisting instead on splitting her time between her mother's small home and the guest chambers Damien had insisted on preparing for her, chambers separate from his own despite his obvious preference that she remain close. She told herself this arrangement gave her space to think, to breathe, to figure out what she actually believed about the bond that everyone around her seemed to accept as an unquestionable fact. In truth, she suspected she was simply afraid of how quickly she was beginning to trust a man she had known for less than a week. The council meeting on the second night had gone exactly as poorly as she expected. She had stood at Damien's side in a grand hall filled with wolves of considerable standing, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from open hostility to barely concealed curiosity, none of them offering anything close to warmth. Countess Miriam Hale had led most of the questioning, her tone polite on the surface but sharp enough underneath to draw blood with every sentence. Where was Elena's family from? Why had no one ever heard of the Voss name before? Was it not somewhat convenient that an Omega, with nothing to offer, had suddenly found herself elevated to the highest position a woman in the territory could hold? Elena had answered as honestly as she could, though honesty had done little to soften the room's collective skepticism. She did not know much about her father's side of the family. He had died before she was old enough to remember him, and her mother rarely spoke of him, always changing the subject whenever Elena asked too many questions. All she knew was that her mother had raised her alone, working whatever jobs she could find, moving them between small rented rooms whenever money grew too tight to stay in one place. It was not the answer the council wanted, and Elena had felt the weight of their disapproval pressing down on her the entire walk back to her chambers that night. Nathan Cole had not attended the council meeting, a fact Elena had not thought much about until now, standing in the hallway with a knife still trembling in the doorframe beside where her head had been only seconds earlier. Who threw this? Damien's voice cut through the chaos like a blade of its own, cold and controlled in a way that silenced the corridor almost instantly. Guards were already fanning out in every direction, searching the adjoining rooms and stairwells, but whoever had thrown the knife had clearly vanished the moment it left their hand. I didn't see anyone, Elena managed, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to steady it. I was walking back from the garden. There was no warning at all. Damien's hands moved over her shoulders, her arms, checking for injury, with an urgency that bordered on frantic, before he seemed to remember himself, and pulled back slightly, though the tension in his jaw remained. You are not hurt? No, Elena said, just frightened. Search every corridor, Damien said to the captain of his guard, a broad-shouldered man named Oliver who had appeared at his side within seconds of the commotion beginning. Every servant, every visitor who has been in this wing today. I want to know who had access to this hallway, and I want to know within the hour. Oliver nodded sharply, and began issuing orders of his own, guards fanning out through the palace with grim efficiency. Damien turned back to Elena, and for the first time since she had woken in his bed, she saw something close to genuine fear in his expression, quickly buried beneath the same controlled fury he had shown moments earlier. Come with me, he said. You are not staying in the guest wing tonight, and I will not be argued out of that decision. Elena did not have the strength to argue, still shaking from how close the blade had come, still trying to process the fact that someone within these walls apparently wanted her dead badly enough to attempt something so brazen in broad daylight. She let Damien lead her back toward his own chambers, aware of the guards trailing behind them, aware of the whispers already starting to ripple through the palace staff who had witnessed the aftermath. Once inside his rooms, With the door firmly closed and guards posted outside, Damien finally allowed some of the tension to leave his shoulders, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. This was not a random act, he said, pacing the length of the room with barely restrained energy. Someone planned this. Someone knew your route through the palace, knew the timing, knew exactly where to position themselves. You think it was someone from the council, Elena said, the realization settling into her stomach like a stone. I think it is possible, Damien said carefully. There are members of my court who have never fully accepted my authority, who see any disruption to the expected order as an opportunity. A fated mate with no family standing, appearing seemingly from nowhere, and immediately elevated above wolves who have spent their entire lives climbing toward power, represents exactly the kind of disruption that makes certain people desperate. Your cousin, Elena said quietly. Nathan. He was not at the council meeting. I have not seen him since the ceremony itself. Something flickered across Damien's face, a complicated mixture of suspicion and reluctance. Nathan has ambitions. He has always had ambitions. But he is also family, and I do not make accusations against family without proof. Someone just tried to kill me, Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended, exhaustion and fear finally breaking through the careful composure she had been maintaining since arriving at the palace. I understand caution, Damien. Truly I do. But I am the one whose life is apparently in danger, and I would like to understand exactly how much danger I am actually in, before I decide whether staying here is worth the risk. Damien stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, and for a moment, the king's careful authority slipped away entirely, revealing something far more vulnerable underneath. I will not let anything happen to you, Elena. I know that promise means little to you right now, given how little time we have known each other, but I need you to understand that it is not an empty promise. My wolf recognized you as mine the moment you fell into my arms, and that recognition is not something I take lightly, regardless of what the council believes, or what games my cousin might be playing. Elena studied his face, searching for the calculation she still half expected to find, the hidden motive, the political maneuvering that Miriam Hale and the rest of the council seemed so convinced must be lurking somewhere beneath his claims. She found none of it, only exhaustion and worry, and something that looked uncomfortably like genuine affection, for a woman he had known for less than a week. I don't know how to trust any of this, she admitted quietly. A week ago, I was grinding herbs in a healer's tent, worried about whether I could afford my mother's medicine. Now, I am living in a palace, being told an ancient bond has chosen me as your mate, and someone apparently wants me dead for it. None of this makes sense to me, Damien. None of it feels real. I understand, Damien said, and something in his tone suggested he truly did, that the sudden shift in his own life had left him just as unsteady as it had left her, despite his position and power. I am not asking you to trust the bond immediately, or to trust me immediately. I am only asking you to let me keep you safe while we figure the rest of it out together. The offer hung in the air between them, simple and honest, in a way that Elena had not expected from a king. She thought of her mother, still recovering at home, still unaware of how dangerous Elena's new circumstances had become. She thought of the council's cold stares, of Miriam Hale's pointed questions, of Nathan Cole's conspicuous absence from every gathering since the ceremony. She thought of the knife, still embedded in the doorframe down the hall, close enough to have ended her life in an instant. All right, she said finally. I will stay here, for now. But I want answers, Damien. I want to know who did this, and I want to know why. I refuse to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder without understanding what I am even afraid of. I will find out, Damien said. I promise you that. Later that night, after guards had searched every inch of the palace without finding any trace of the attacker, after Oliver had reported that the knife bore no identifying markings and had likely been purchased from a common market stall rather than a palace armory, Elena lay awake in the unfamiliar softness of Damien's bed, listening to him settle into a chair beside her, rather than leave her alone even for a moment. You don't have to stay awake all night, she said quietly into the darkness. I doubt anyone will try again so soon, with guards posted at every door. I will stay anyway, Damien said, his voice low and steady. Sleep, Elena. I will be here when you wake. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she did not need his protection, that she had survived on her own for years without anyone standing guard over her safety. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit even to herself. For the first time since her father had died and her mother had been left to raise her alone, Elena did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever danger lay ahead. Something about that realization frightened her almost as much as the knife that had nearly ended her life hours earlier. Across the palace grounds, in a private estate house that had remained dark and quiet through all the commotion, Nathan Cole sat alone by a low fire, turning a small blade over in his hands, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He had not thrown the knife himself. He was far too careful, far too patient, to risk exposing his own hand so early in whatever game was beginning to unfold within the palace walls. But he had not been surprised to hear of the attempt either. If someone else within the court had grown impatient enough to act rashly, that impatience could prove useful, a distraction that drew attention away from more careful plans already taking shape beneath the surface. Elena Voss represented a problem that needed solving, one way or another, and Nathan had spent years learning the value of patience in matters that required a delicate touch. He set the blade down on the table beside him and reached instead for a stack of old documents, records he had spent considerable time and coin acquiring over the past several days, ever since the name Voss had first been spoken aloud at the ceremony grounds. Buried within those documents lay secrets about Elena's bloodline that even she did not yet know, secrets that, once uncovered, might prove far more dangerous to the palace than any knife thrown in a hallway. He began to read, and as he read, a slow and calculating smile spread across his face, the first genuine expression of satisfaction he had allowed himself since the night everything had changed. The forest went silent, and silence in a hunting party this size meant something had gone terribly wrong. Elena's horse shifted nervously beneath her, ears flicking toward the tree line, and every instinct in her body screamed that they were no longer alone among the trees. Beside her, Damien had gone rigid in his saddle, his eyes scanning the shadows with the focused intensity of a predator who had caught the scent of danger long before his companions noticed anything amiss. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, and Elena did not need to be told twice. The hunt had been Damien's idea, a small gathering meant to ease some of the tension that had settled over the palace since the attack in the hallway 2 weeks earlier. Guards had never identified the attacker despite exhaustive searching, and the uncertainty had worn on everyone, Elena most of all. Damien had suggested the moonlit hunt as a chance to clear her mind, to spend time among trusted companions, in open air, rather than confined within palace walls, where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. It had seemed like a reasonable idea, right up until the moment the forest fell silent around them. In the 2 weeks since the knife incident, Elena had learned things about her own history that she had never known, revelations that arrived not through her own mother, who remained frustratingly vague whenever Elena pressed for details, but through the careful research Damien had commissioned from the palace archivist. Her father, it turned out, had not simply been an ordinary wolf who died young and left no legacy behind. He had belonged to a bloodline exiled from the territory nearly 3 generations earlier, a family once powerful enough to challenge the Ashgrove claim to leadership before a bitter conflict had ended with their exile and the near-total erasure of their name from official records. The archivist had uncovered old documents, faded and incomplete, suggesting that Elena's ancestors had possessed abilities beyond typical shifter strength, some connection to instinct and perception that had made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies in equal measure. Elena had absorbed this information with a strange mixture of disbelief and something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition, as though some deeply buried part of her had always sensed there was more to her heritage than the quiet, unremarkable life her mother had built for them. "Why would my mother never tell me any of this?" she had asked Damien, staring at the fragile old documents spread across his desk. "Fear, most likely," Damien had answered. "If your bloodline was truly exiled under hostile circumstances, she may have believed hiding your heritage was the only way to keep you safe." Safe from what, exactly, remained an open question, one that had grown more urgent with every passing day since the knife had nearly ended Elena's life. If someone within the palace had learned about her bloodline before she herself even knew of it, that knowledge might explain far more about the attack than simple political jealousy over an unexpected mate bond. Now, deep in the forest with the hunting party gone eerily quiet around her, That question felt far less academic than it had in the safety of Damien's study. "There," Oliver said suddenly, his voice low and urgent, pointing toward movement in the trees ahead. Shapes emerged from the shadows. 4 wolves in shifted form, larger than typical hunting predators, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested trained fighters rather than wild animals. "Ambush," Damien growled, already moving to position himself between Elena and the approaching threat. "Oliver, get her back toward the tree line. I will hold them here." "I am not leaving you," Elena said, fear sharpening into something closer to determination as adrenaline flooded her system. "This is not a discussion," Damien said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king used to being obeyed instantly. "Go, Elena. Now." But before Oliver could pull her horse's reins, one of the shifted wolves broke from the group and lunged directly toward Elena, rather than toward Damien, moving with a speed that suggested this attack had been planned specifically around her presence, rather than any general threat to the hunting party. Elena's horse reared in panic, and she felt herself sliding from the saddle, the world tilting exactly as it had the night of the ceremony months earlier. Except this time, there were no gentle arms waiting to catch her, only hard ground, and a snarling predator, closing the distance with terrifying speed. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs, and for one terrifying moment, she lay stunned, staring up at the wolf now looming over her, teeth bared, eyes gleaming with a focused malice that left no doubt about its intentions. Something happened inside her chest in that frozen instant, something she had never experienced before, and would struggle to explain afterward even to herself. A wave of awareness rushed through her, sudden and overwhelming, and she felt herself somehow sensing the wolf's next movement before it happened, an instinct sharper and more certain than anything she had ever known. She rolled to the side, a fraction of a second, before its jaws snapped shut on empty air, where her throat had been. Damien's roar tore through the clearing as he closed the distance in a blur of motion, his own shift already complete, meeting the attacking wolf with a force that sent both animals tumbling through the underbrush. The remaining 3 wolves scattered as Oliver and the rest of the hunting party finally reached the clearing, swords drawn, forcing the attackers into a hasty and disorganized retreat before any of them could be captured or identified. Elena lay on the ground for a long moment, breathing hard, staring up at the canopy of trees overhead, trying to make sense of what had just happened, of the strange awareness that had flooded through her at the exact moment she needed it most. It had not felt like luck. It had felt like something waking up inside her, something ancient and instinctive that had been dormant her entire life, until the precise moment she needed it to save her own life. Damien reached her side moments later, back in human form, his expression a mixture of fury and barely controlled panic, as he knelt beside her, checking for injuries with hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts to remain composed. "I'm all right," Elena managed, though her voice shook as badly as his hands. "Something happened. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew where it was going to move before it moved. I felt it, like an instinct, but stronger than anything I have ever experienced." Damien's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. "Your bloodline." The archivist mentioned abilities tied to instinct and perception. "This may be the first time that heritage has fully awakened within you." "Convenient timing," Elena said, a shaky attempt at humor that did little to ease the tension still coiled tight in her chest. "Not convenient," Damien said seriously, helping her to her feet and keeping one arm firmly around her shoulders, as though reluctant to let go, even now that the immediate danger had passed. "Necessary. Your body protected itself when it needed to most. That is not something to dismiss as coincidence." Oliver approached them grimly, his sword still drawn, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the attacker's return. "They're gone, Your Majesty. Professional fighters, judging by their coordination." This was no accident, and no random pack of rogue wolves. Someone sent them specifically. "Sent them for Elena," Damien said, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. "The one that broke from the group went straight for her, ignoring the rest of us entirely. Which means whoever ordered this attack knows exactly who Elena is, and considers her enough of a threat to send trained fighters after her, rather than simply relying on a single thrown knife," Oliver said grimly. The ride back to the palace passed in tense silence, Elena keeping close to Damien's side the entire way, her mind racing through everything that had happened, trying to piece together why anyone would consider her dangerous enough to warrant such an organized attack. She was newly mated, newly discovering an unfamiliar heritage, still learning to navigate a world of politics and power she had never asked to be part of. What threat could she possibly represent significant enough to justify this level of danger? The answer arrived that same night, delivered not by Damien or Oliver or anyone within the palace, but by the archivist Damien had commissioned to research Elena's family history, who arrived at the palace gates well past midnight, breathless and pale, clutching a stack of newly uncovered documents against his chest. "Your Majesty," the archivist said, bowing hastily, before Damien, even as his eyes kept flicking nervously toward Elena. "I found something in the older records, buried deep in the archive vault beneath the council chambers. Something about the exile of Elena's bloodline that I believe changes everything we thought we understood." Damien led them both into his private study, and the archivist spread the fragile documents across the desk, with trembling hands, pointing toward passages written in faded, careful script. Elena's bloodline was not simply exiled for challenging Ashgrove leadership generations ago, the archivist said. According to these records, they were exiled because the ruling council at the time feared the abilities carried within their bloodline, abilities tied to sensing deception and betrayal within a pack. Your ancestors, Elena, could apparently perceive treachery that others could not see, an ability the council of that era considered too dangerous to allow near the seat of power. Elena stared at the documents, understanding beginning to dawn with a cold and unsettling clarity. Someone within the current council fears that same ability might return. Precisely, the archivist said, and if such an ability has indeed awakened within you, as tonight's events might suggest, then you represent an existential threat to anyone within this palace, currently engaged in treachery of their own. Anyone hiding secrets, anyone plotting against the crown, would have every reason imaginable to want you eliminated, before that ability could fully develop and expose them. Damien's expression had darkened considerably as the archivist spoke, his mind clearly working through the implications, with the same speed Elena's own thoughts were racing. Which narrows our list of suspects considerably. Whoever ordered tonight's attack is not simply opposed to our bond on political grounds. They are hiding something specific, something they fear. Elena's growing abilities might eventually reveal. Elena thought immediately of Nathan Cole, absent from every gathering since the ceremony, quietly researching her family's history, according to whispers she had heard from palace staff. Always positioned at the careful edges of every important conversation, without ever fully committing himself to any visible action. "Your cousin," she said quietly. "I know you have been reluctant to suspect him without proof, but everything about tonight points towards someone who has been planning this for a very long time, someone with the resources and patience to organize trained fighters, and keep their own hands entirely clean throughout." Damien was silent for a long moment, staring down at the ancient documents spread across his desk, his expression carrying the weight of a man forced to confront a betrayal he had spent years refusing to fully acknowledge, even to himself. "I will not act on suspicion alone," he said finally. "But I will no longer dismiss the possibility either. Oliver will begin watching Nathan's movements closely, discreetly, until we have proof one way or another. In the meantime, Elena, I want you training with the archivist to better understand whatever ability has awakened within you. If your bloodline's gift is truly what stands between us and whoever is orchestrating these attacks, we need to understand its full potential as quickly as possible." Elena nodded, exhaustion and fear giving way slowly to something firmer, something closer to resolve. She had spent her entire life believing herself unremarkable, invisible, easily overlooked. The idea that she now carried an ability powerful enough to threaten a hidden traitor within the highest levels of the palace felt both terrifying and, in some small and unexpected way, like the first piece of genuine purpose she had ever been given. Outside the study window, the moon hung high and silent over the palace grounds, indifferent to the danger gathering beneath its light, indifferent to the careful plans still taking shape in the shadows of an estate house not far from where Elena now stood, safe for the moment, but for how much longer, none of them could yet say. The training room exploded into splinters the moment Elena lost control. Wooden practice weapons shattered against the far wall, sent flying by a burst of raw, unfocused power that even Elena herself did not fully understand. And the archivist, who had been guiding her session, dove for cover behind an overturned table, shouting something Elena could not hear, over the roaring in her own ears. "Elena," Damien's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, and slowly, painfully, she managed to pull the surging awareness back inside herself, the way he had taught her to do, over the past month of training sessions, that had grown increasingly intense, as her abilities continued to develop, in ways none of them had fully anticipated. She sank to her knees, breathing hard, sweat dampening her hair despite the cool air of the training room. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. It just built up too fast, and I couldn't hold it back." "You are learning to control something your bloodline spent generations refining," Damien said, crossing the room to kneel beside her, his hand warm and steady against her back. "It will not come easily or quickly. Give yourself patience." A month had passed since the ambush in the forest, and in that time, Elena's life had transformed in ways she still struggled to fully process. The awareness that had awakened during the attack had not faded afterward, as she had half expected it might. Instead, it had grown steadily stronger, sharper, more difficult to control, manifesting not only as an ability to sense danger before it struck, but as something far more unsettling, a growing capacity to perceive dishonesty in those around her, to feel the subtle wrongness of a lie the moment it left someone's lips. The archivist, whose name Elena had learned was Edwin, had proven an invaluable guide through this unfamiliar territory, drawing on the fragmented old records of her bloodline to help her understand what her ancestors had once called the sense of betrayal, an ability that had made them indispensable advisors and terrifying enemies in equal measure throughout their long history, before the exile that had erased their name from the territory's collective memory. "You felt something specific just now, before the room exploded," Damien said gently, helping her to her feet, as Edwin cautiously emerged from behind the overturned table. "What triggered it?" Elena hesitated, trying to put words to the sensation that had overwhelmed her moments earlier. "I was thinking about the council meeting scheduled for tomorrow, about Nathan. Every time I try to focus on him specifically, the feeling gets stronger, sharper, almost painful. It's like my body already knows something my mind hasn't figured out yet." Oliver's careful surveillance over the past month had turned up frustratingly little concrete evidence against Nathan Cole, despite Damien's growing suspicion that his cousin sat at the center of the conspiracy threatening Elena's life. Nathan had grown noticeably more careful since the forest ambush, rarely leaving his estate house without a legitimate reason, never meeting with anyone who could not account for their presence through perfectly reasonable explanations. If he was indeed guilty, he was proving far too clever to be caught through simple observation alone. "Perhaps it is time to test your ability more directly," Edwin suggested cautiously, still eyeing the splintered remains of the practice weapons scattered across the training room floor. A controlled encounter, rather than passive observation. If Elena's gift is truly tied to sensing deception, a direct conversation with Nathan might reveal far more than months of careful watching ever could. Damien's expression darkened at the suggestion, protective instinct clearly warring with practical necessity. "That would mean placing Elena directly in front of the very person we suspect wants her dead. With guards positioned throughout the room, and you standing beside her the entire time," Edwin said. "The council meeting tomorrow will require Nathan's attendance regardless. It is simply a matter of arranging for Elena to speak with him directly, rather than avoiding the interaction as we have been doing." Elena considered the suggestion carefully, weighing the fear that still lingered from the forest attack against the growing frustration of living under constant threat, without any clear path toward resolving it. "I want to do it," she said finally. "I am tired of waiting for someone else to make the next move. If my ability can help identify who is truly behind this, I want to use it, whatever the risk." Damien studied her for a long moment, something between pride and worry, passing across his features, before finally nodding. "Then we do it carefully. Oliver stations guards throughout the council chamber. I remain at your side the entire time, and the moment you sense anything concerning, you signal me immediately, and we act without hesitation." That night, unable to sleep with the following day's confrontation weighing heavily on her mind, Elena found herself wandering the palace gardens alone, the cool night air, a welcome relief after the intensity of the day's training session. She had not expected to find Damien already there, sitting on a low stone bench beneath a canopy of flowering vines, staring up at the same moon that had witnessed the forest ambush a month earlier. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling onto the bench beside him, without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the past weeks, despite the uncertain beginning of their bond. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," Damien admitted. "About the possibility that Nathan is truly responsible for everything that has happened. He is my cousin, Elena. We grew up together. I taught him to hunt, to fight, to understand what it meant to lead with honor rather than force alone. The idea that he might have orchestrated attempts on your life feels almost impossible to accept, even with everything Oliver has uncovered." "I understand," Elena said softly. "It is difficult to accept betrayal from someone you love, even when the evidence points clearly in that direction." Damien turned to look at her, moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face, and something in his expression shifted into a quieter, more vulnerable honesty than Elena had seen from him before. "I did not expect any of this, you know. The bond, the danger, the way my entire understanding of my own family has been thrown into question. I had built a life around careful control, around knowing exactly what each day would require of me. And then you collapsed into my arms at the ceremony, and every certainty I had built my life around simply fell away." "I know the feeling," Elena said quietly. "A month ago I was grinding herbs in a healer's tent, worried about nothing more complicated than how to afford my mother's medicine. Now I am apparently the last living heir to a bloodline with abilities powerful enough to threaten a hidden traitor in the highest levels of your court. None of this feels like the life I was supposed to have." "Do you regret it?" Damien asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. "The bond, I mean. If you could undo it, walk away from all of this danger and complication, would you?" Elena considered the question seriously, aware of how much rested on her honest answer. She thought of the fear that had gripped her the night of the knife in the hallway, the terror of the forest ambush, the exhausting uncertainty of navigating a court that seemed determined to view her as an unworthy intruder. And then she thought of Damien's steady presence beside her through all of it, his genuine care for her mother's health, the gentleness beneath his authority that few outside this quiet garden ever seemed to witness, the strange and undeniable sense of belonging that had grown between them despite everything working against it. "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I don't regret it. I am frightened and exhausted, and I still don't fully understand what any of this means for my future. But I don't regret the bond itself, or the time I have spent getting to know you these past weeks. If anything, I think I am beginning to understand what the elders meant when they spoke of fate choosing something older and wiser than either of us could choose for ourselves." Something in Damien's expression softened entirely at her words, the careful composure of a king giving way to something far more personal. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "I have wanted to do that since the first moment you woke in my bed," he admitted quietly. "I did not want to overwhelm you, given everything you were already facing, but I find myself running out of patience for waiting." Elena leaned into his touch, some instinct deeper than conscious thought guiding the motion, and felt the warm, familiar pulse of the bond stirring beneath her skin, stronger now than it had been even that first night, strengthened by weeks of shared danger and growing trust. "You don't have to wait any longer," she whispered. What followed was not rushed or desperate, but slow and deliberate, a gentle unfolding of two people who had spent weeks circling around a connection neither of them fully understood, but both had grown to trust. Damien's kiss was soft at first, questioning, giving her every chance to pull back, and when she did not, when instead she leaned further into him, his hand came up to cradle the back of her head with a reverence that spoke louder than any words could have managed. They remained in the garden long after the kiss ended, simply sitting together beneath the moonlight, Elena's head resting against his shoulder, while he traced idle patterns against her arm, both of them aware that tomorrow would bring danger and uncertainty, but neither willing to let that knowledge steal this quiet, unguarded moment from them. The council chamber the following morning felt colder and more hostile than Elena remembered from her first appearance weeks earlier, the assembled nobles watching her entrance with the same mixture of curiosity and disdain that had greeted her that first difficult night. Nathan Cole sat near the far end of the long table, dressed in careful, understated elegance, his expression polite and unreadable, as Elena took her seat beside Damien at the head of the chamber. The meeting proceeded through routine matters first, territorial disputes and resource allocations that held little of Elena's attention, as she focused instead on the growing awareness building steadily in her chest, watching Nathan carefully from across the room, waiting for the moment Edwin had suggested might reveal something useful. That moment arrived when Damien raised the subject of the recent attacks directly, his voice carrying deliberate weight as he addressed the assembled council. As you are all aware, my mate has now survived 2 separate attempts on her life within the past month, Damien said, his eyes sweeping the table slowly, deliberately. I intend to find those responsible, regardless of their standing within this court. I trust everyone present understands the seriousness with which I regard this matter. A ripple of uneasy murmurs passed through the chamber, and Elena felt the awareness in her chest sharpen suddenly, painfully, focused entirely on the far end of the table where Nathan sat, with an expression that had not shifted at all, remaining perfectly composed, even as the tension in the room thickened around him. That composure itself felt wrong to her, a stillness too deliberate, too controlled, the kind of careful calm that came not from innocence, but from years of practice at concealing exactly what one wished to hide. The sensation built inside her chest like pressure behind a closed door, and she gripped the edge of the table beneath her hands, struggling to maintain her own composure, as the certainty grew undeniable. Elena, Damien said quietly, having clearly noticed the shift in her expression, what do you sense? Every eye in the chamber turned toward her, and Elena felt the weight of that attention pressing down, alongside the growing certainty in her chest. She looked directly at Nathan Cole, and for the briefest moment, something flickered behind his careful composure, a flash of genuine alarm quickly suppressed, but not quite quickly enough for her newly awakened senses to miss entirely. He's lying, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. Not about everything, but about something specific tied to these attacks. I can feel it as clearly as I feel my own pulse. The chamber erupted into chaos, nobles rising from their seats, voices raised in outrage and disbelief. Miriam Hale's voice cutting sharply through the noise, demanding proof, rather than what she called the unsubstantiated claims of an Omega with a convenient new ability. Nathan himself remained seated, his expression carefully arranged into wounded confusion, though Elena's senses screamed the falseness of that composure with every passing second. This is exactly the kind of chaos that follows from elevating someone with no proper standing to a position of such influence, Nathan said, his voice carrying just the right note of weary patience. I understand the strain everyone has been under, given these terrible attacks, but surely, we cannot begin accusing family members based on nothing more than feelings and instinct. It is not nothing, Damien said, his voice cutting through the chamber's noise with absolute authority. Elena's ability is tied to a bloodline the council itself once feared enough to exile entirely. I will not dismiss her senses as mere feeling, Nathan, and I suggest you consider carefully how eager you are to discredit her, before we have gathered further evidence. Nathan's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Elena to catch it, a flash of something colder and more calculating passing behind his eyes before the careful mask slid back into place. Of course, cousin. I only meant to urge caution before accusations damage relationships within this family that have stood for generations. The meeting ended shortly after, unresolved and tense, the council dispersing with uneasy whispers trailing behind them. But as Elena walked beside Damien back toward his private chambers, the certainty in her chest had not faded at all. If anything, it had sharpened into something close to conviction. He knows we suspect him now, she said quietly, once they were alone. Whatever plans he has been building, he will move more carefully, more quickly, before we can gather enough proof to move against him directly. Then we will simply have to move faster than he expects, Damien said, his jaw set with grim determination. Whatever Nathan is planning, Elena, I promise you this. We will uncover it before he has the chance to finish what he started in that forest a month ago. Neither of them noticed, as they walked away from the council chamber, the servant lingering near a side corridor, who had overheard every word of the confrontation, a servant whose loyalty, unbeknownst to anyone in the palace, belonged entirely to Nathan Cole, and who slipped away quietly the moment the hallway cleared. already hurrying toward the estate house at the edge of the territory, to deliver a warning that would set the final, dangerous stage of Nathan's long, patient plan into motion at last. Smoke poured from the western tower before the first alarm bell even finished ringing. Elena bolted upright in bed, the acrid scent already reaching her through the open window, and by the time Damien burst through the door, half-dressed and already shifting into the commanding presence of a king facing crisis, the entire palace had erupted into shouting and running footsteps. "Stay here," Damien said, pulling on his boots with practiced speed. "Oliver will post guards at your door." "Absolutely not," Elena said, already reaching for her own clothes. "If this is Nathan's doing, and I believe it is, then this fire is a distraction, meant to pull attention away from wherever he actually intends to strike. I am not staying locked in a room while you face that alone." Damien's jaw tightened, torn between the fierce protective instinct that had defined every interaction between them since the ceremony, and the growing respect he had developed for Elena's judgment over the past weeks. "Fine. But you stay close to me, and the moment I tell you to retreat, you retreat without argument." Elena nodded, and together they moved into the chaos of the palace corridors, servants rushing past with buckets of water, guards shouting coordinates and orders, the acrid smell of smoke growing thicker with every step toward the western tower. But as they navigated the crowded hallway, Elena felt the familiar pressure building in her chest again, sharper and more urgent than she had ever experienced it before, pulling her attention not toward the visible chaos of the fire, but toward a quieter corridor, branching away from the main commotion, leading toward the private study, where Damien kept the palace's most sensitive records. "Damien," she said urgently, grabbing his arm, "the fire isn't the real threat. Something is happening in your study. I can feel it pulling at me, stronger than anything before." Damien hesitated only a moment before trusting her instinct completely, turning away from the crowd rushing toward the tower, and instead leading them both toward the quieter wing of the palace, where his private study sat, isolated, and now eerily silent compared to the chaos elsewhere. They found the study door already standing open, and inside, illuminated by a single burning candle, stood Nathan Cole, a stack of ancient documents spread across the desk before him, documents that Elena recognized immediately as the fragile old records detailing her bloodline's exile generations earlier. "Cousin," Damien said, his voice deadly quiet, stepping fully into the room with Elena close behind him. "I should have known the fire was your distraction." Nathan did not startle, did not scramble for an explanation, the way a man caught unprepared might have. Instead he straightened slowly, an expression of weary resignation settling over his features, the careful mask he had worn for weeks finally beginning to slip away entirely. "You should have known a great many things sooner, Damien," Nathan said. "But you were always too trusting, too eager to believe the best of the people around you. It is a fine quality in a friend, and a dangerous weakness in a king." "Why?" Damien asked, and the single word carried the full weight of years of shared history, of a childhood spent together, of trust built over decades now crumbling in a single confrontation. "We grew up together, Nathan. I never gave you reason to see me as an enemy." "You never had to give me a reason," Nathan said, something bitter and long buried finally breaking through his composure. "I watched you inherit everything, simply because of the order of our births. I watched the council defer to you on matters I understood far better than you ever bothered to learn. I spent years building the knowledge and the connections that should have made me a worthy leader, and none of it mattered, because fate had already decided the throne belonged to you, before either of us ever had a choice in the matter. So you decided to take it instead," Elena said quietly, understanding dawning with painful clarity. "The attacks against me were never truly about the bond at all. They were about removing an obstacle that threatened to expose whatever you have been planning against Damien himself." Nathan's eyes shifted toward her, and something colder settled into his expression. "You were an unexpected complication, I admit. I had spent years quietly building support among council members, who shared my belief that Damien's leadership had grown too soft, too generous, with resources that should have been used to strengthen our territory's standing among our rivals. A fated mate with a bloodline once considered dangerous enough to warrant exile threatened to disrupt years of careful planning, particularly once your abilities began to awaken." "You knew about my bloodline before I did," Elena realized, That is why you researched my family history so quickly after the ceremony. You already suspected what dormant ability I might carry. I make it a practice to understand every variable that might affect my plans, Nathan said. Your bloodline's history was well documented in the older council records, if one knew where to look and was patient enough to search. When I learned Damien's fated mate carried that same exiled bloodline, I understood immediately that you represented a significant threat to everything I had been building. And these documents? Damien asked, gesturing toward the papers spread across his own desk. What were you searching for tonight? Proof, Nathan said simply. Proof that could be used to convince the council that Elena's bloodline represents exactly the danger their ancestors once feared. Proof that could justify her removal through legitimate political means, rather than the clumsy attempts my hired associates have already failed to accomplish twice now. I had hoped to find something damning enough to turn the council against her before matters progressed any further between the two of you. And instead, you found nothing but confirmation that her ancestors were exiled out of fear, rather than genuine wrongdoing, Damien said, understanding settling into his expression. Fear that you have been cultivating deliberately, the same way your predecessors once did, because the truth threatens the position you have spent years trying to secure for yourself. Nathan's expression hardened, the last traces of his careful composure falling away entirely. It does not matter now. Whether you understand my reasons or not, the outcome remains the same. The fire will draw every guard in the palace toward the western tower, and by the time anyone realizes I am not among those fighting the flames, I will already be gone, along with whatever documents prove useful to my continued efforts against your throne. You are not going anywhere, Damien said, moving forward with the controlled fury of a king, finally facing the betrayal he had spent weeks refusing to fully accept. What happened next unfolded quickly, though Elena would spend considerable time afterward, trying to piece together the exact sequence of events. Nathan lunged not toward Damien, but toward the study's side door, clearly intending to flee, rather than face a direct confrontation he could not hope to win, against an Alpha King's raw strength. Elena, acting on instinct sharpened by weeks of training, felt the familiar pressure building in her chest, and released it deliberately for the first time, pushing outward with the same overwhelming awareness that had once shattered practice weapons across a training room. The wave of sensation struck Nathan mid-stride, and though it caused him no physical harm, the sudden and overwhelming flood of exposed guilt, of every carefully buried fear and calculation, laid bare all at once, staggered him badly enough that he stumbled, giving Damien the precious seconds needed to close the distance between them. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive, Damien's superior strength and years of discipline overwhelming Nathan's desperate resistance within moments, until Nathan lay subdued on the study floor, guards summoned by the commotion pouring into the room to secure him properly under Oliver's grim supervision. The fire, Elena said suddenly, remembering the chaos still unfolding elsewhere in the palace. We need to make sure it's contained. Already handled, Oliver reported, arriving moments later with soot staining his uniform and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. It was smaller than it appeared, set deliberately in a location that would create maximum smoke and panic without significant structural damage. Nathan's associates clearly intended it as a distraction, rather than genuine destruction, exactly as Elena suspected. Damien looked down at his cousin, restrained now and stripped of the careful composure he had maintained for weeks, and something complicated passed across his features, grief mingling uneasily with the fury of betrayal. The full council will decide his fate, according to proper procedure, but I want him watched closely until that judgment can be rendered. As guards led Nathan away, his expression finally settling into something like resigned defeat, Damien turned to Elena, exhaustion and relief warring in his expression. You saved us both tonight. If you had not sensed the truth of what was happening in this study, Nathan might have escaped entirely, taking with him enough evidence to eventually turn the council against you regardless of the truth. We saved each other, Elena said softly. I could not have found him in time without your trust in my instincts. And I certainly could not have stopped him without your strength standing beside me. In the days that followed, the full truth of Nathan's betrayal emerged through careful investigation, revealing a conspiracy that had been building for years, longer than anyone within the palace had suspected. He had been quietly cultivating support among discontented council members, promising favors and positions of influence once he successfully claimed the throne for himself, patiently waiting for an opportunity to move against Damien without exposing his own involvement too obviously. Elena's unexpected appearance as Damien's fated mate and the awakening of her exiled bloodline's abilities had accelerated timelines Nathan had originally intended to unfold far more slowly and carefully. The council, faced with undeniable evidence of Nathan's conspiracy, voted unanimously to strip him of his title and position within the territory's leadership, exiling him from Ashgrove lands entirely, a fate he accepted with the same cold composure that had defined his careful plotting throughout the entire ordeal. Countess Miriam Hale, whose earlier hostility toward Elena had never quite crossed into genuine conspiracy, found herself facing her own reckoning. As investigation revealed, she had known more about Nathan's ambitions than she had ever admitted, resulting in her own removal from the council, though without the harsher punishment reserved for Nathan himself. With the immediate threat finally resolved, the palace settled slowly into a quieter rhythm, one that allowed Elena and Damien the space to build something genuine between them, unburdened by the constant fear that had shadowed every previous interaction since the night of the ceremony. Elena's mother, fully recovered thanks to the palace healer's continued care, moved into a comfortable cottage within the territory grounds, close enough for regular visits, but independent enough to satisfy her own quiet preference for a simple life, away from palace politics. Elena's abilities continued to develop under Edwin's careful guidance, no longer erupting in uncontrolled bursts but growing instead into a refined and valuable tool that Damien began incorporating directly into council matters, her sense for deception proving invaluable in identifying dishonesty among visiting dignitaries and internal disputes alike. The variability that had once marked her bloodline for exile out of fear now stood recognized throughout the territory as a gift of tremendous worth, a transformation that felt, to Elena, like a quiet vindication for ancestors who had been wrongly cast aside generations earlier. On a clear evening several weeks after Nathan's exile, Damien led Elena to the same garden bench where they had first kissed beneath the moonlight, and this time, rather than simply sitting together in comfortable silence, he knelt before her with an expression of nervous determination that looked almost out of place on a man usually so certain of himself. "I know our bond was never something either of us chose deliberately," he said, taking her hands in his own, "but every day since that first night has only deepened my certainty that fate chose exactly right, even if the circumstances surrounding it were more dangerous than either of us could have anticipated. Elena Voss, I am asking you now, freely and with full intention, to stand beside me, not merely as my fated mate, but as my queen, ruling this territory together as true partners in every sense." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, thinking of the exhausted, overlooked Omega, who had collapsed at the edge of a ceremony crowd months earlier, never imagining her life could transform so completely, so unexpectedly, into something this full of purpose and genuine belonging. "Yes," she said simply, and the word carried more certainty than she had ever felt about anything in her entire life. "Yes, Damien, I will stand beside you, as your mate, as your queen, for as long as fate allows us." The coronation that followed weeks later drew crowds from every corner of the territory, wolves who had once whispered doubts about an Omega, with no pack, standing now gathering to witness her formal recognition as Alpha Queen, a title she accepted with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned her place, not through birth or privilege, but through courage, resilience, and a bloodline finally restored to the honor it had always deserved. As Elena stood beside Damien on the same ceremony grounds where she had once collapsed into his arms as a frightened stranger, she felt the weight of the crown settling onto her head, not as a burden, but as a promise to the territory she now called home, to the mother whose sacrifices had shaped her, and to the ancestors whose exile had finally, after 3 long generations, been answered with justice rather than fear. The crowd's cheers rose into the night sky, and Elena, no longer the invisible Omega who had once expected nothing from life beyond quiet survival, stood tall at the center of everything, an Alpha Queen whose story had only just begun. A messenger collapsed at the palace gates, 6 months after the coronation, blood soaking through the bandage wrapped around his arm, gasping out a single word before he lost consciousness entirely. Invasion. Elena reached him first, her instincts as queen now sharpened by months of experience into something far more disciplined than the raw, uncontrolled power that had once shattered practice weapons across a training room. She knelt beside the fallen messenger, pressing her palm briefly against his forehead, and felt immediately that his words carried no trace of deception, no confusion born of panic, only the desperate truth of a man who had ridden through the night to deliver a warning that could not wait. "Get him to the healers," she called out, and guards moved instantly at her command, a testament to how thoroughly the territory had come to trust her authority in the months since her coronation. She rose and turned toward the palace, already moving to find Damien, her mind racing through the implications of a single, terrifying word. She found him in the war room minutes later, already receiving reports from a second messenger who had arrived only moments before the first, confirming what Elena had already suspected. A rival territory to the east, one that had watched the Ashgrove lands with cautious interest for years, had apparently decided that the recent upheaval within the pack, the scandal of Nathan's exile, and the unconventional rise of an unproven queen, represented an opportunity too tempting to ignore. "Their forces crossed the eastern border 2 days ago," Damien said grimly, spreading a territorial map across the war table. "They have been moving quickly, avoiding our usual patrol routes, clearly counting on catching us unprepared." "They believe we are weakened," Elena said, studying the map with the same focused clarity she brought to every council matter now. "They see Nathan's betrayal and assume it left this territory divided and vulnerable." "They assume wrong," Damien said, though the tightness in his jaw revealed the genuine concern beneath his confident words. "But we cannot afford to underestimate them either. Their forces are larger than ours, and if they have been planning this for months, they will have accounted for our typical defensive strategies." Elena studied the map for a long moment, an idea forming slowly as she traced the eastern border with her finger, considering the terrain, the timing, the patterns of movement described in the messenger's reports. What if we do not rely on typical strategies at all? What if we use exactly what makes this territory different now, the very abilities they are counting on being a weakness rather than a strength? Damien looked at her with growing interest. "Explain." "My ability lets me sense deception," Elena said, "but over the past months, working with Edwin, I have learned it extends further than simple lies. I can sense intention, hesitation, the subtle shifts in resolve that come before someone commits fully to a dangerous action. If I position myself where I can observe their forward scouts, I may be able to identify exactly where their true attack will fall, rather than the feints they will certainly send to draw our defenses in the wrong direction." "That would require you standing dangerously close to the front lines," Damien said, old protective instincts flaring immediately. "It would require trusting me the way you have trusted me since the night I sensed Nathan's guilt in your study," Elena said gently but firmly. "I am not the same frightened Omega who collapsed into your arms all those months ago, Damien. I have trained for this. I have grown into this role beside you, not simply as your mate, but as a genuine partner in defending this territory. Let me help in the way only I can." Damien studied her for a long, searching moment, and Elena watched the familiar war within him, the fierce desire to protect her warring against the respect he had built for her judgment and growing strength. Finally he nodded, slowly, deliberately. "Then we do this together. You will not stand at the front line alone. Wherever you position yourself, I will be beside you." The following days passed in a blur of careful preparation, Oliver coordinating defensive positions along the eastern border, while Elena and Damien rode ahead with a small, trusted group to observe the approaching forces from a concealed ridge overlooking the border valley. Elena focused her awareness outward, exactly as Edwin had taught her, extending the sense that had once overwhelmed her uncontrollably into something precise and deliberate, reading the subtle currents of intention rippling through the distant enemy camp. "There," she said finally, pointing toward a smaller detachment, positioned at the northern edge of the valley, separate from the main force gathering more visibly at the valley's center. "The main force is a feint. I can feel the hesitation in their movements, the performance of confidence rather than genuine commitment. But that smaller group to the north, their intention is sharp, focused, entirely certain. That is where the true attack will come." Damien relayed the information immediately through coordinated signals to Oliver's waiting forces, and when the enemy's northern detachment moved under cover of darkness 2 nights later, exactly as Elena had predicted, they found themselves met not by an undefended border, but by a fully prepared defense. Ashgrove forces positioned with precise knowledge of exactly where and when the true assault would fall. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. The invading forces carefully laid strategy, collapsing entirely, once its central advantage, the element of surprise, had been stripped away through Elena's unprecedented insight. Facing a defense they could not have anticipated, the rival territories' commanders called for a swift retreat rather than risk further losses, and within days, formal messengers arrived proposing terms of peace rather than continued conflict. The peace negotiations that followed marked Elena's first significant appearance on the wider political stage beyond Ashgrove territory, and she approached the task with the same careful determination that had carried her through every challenge since the night of the ceremony. Seated beside Damien at the negotiating table, she found herself able to sense not only outright deception, but the subtler currents of genuine fear and exhaustion driving the rival territory's leadership, insight that allowed the negotiations to move toward a settlement that addressed real underlying tensions, rather than simply papering over old grievances with temporary promises. The treaty signed weeks later established not merely peace between the two territories, but the foundation of genuine cooperation. Trade routes opened, resources shared, a partnership built on the kind of honest understanding that Elena's unique gift had made possible in ways that traditional diplomacy alone might never have achieved. Word of the Alpha Queen's role in averting a costly conflict spread quickly throughout the wider territories, and Elena found herself regarded now not merely as Damien's mate elevated by fortunate circumstance, but as a leader whose contributions to the kingdom's safety and prosperity stood entirely on their own merit. The whispers that had once followed her through palace corridors, questioning her worthiness, her standing, her right to sit beside a king, had transformed slowly but completely into something closer to genuine respect and, in many cases, quiet admiration. On a warm evening months later, Elena stood once more in the palace gardens, watching her mother laugh with grace near the fountain, watching Damien speak with Oliver and Edwin about routine matters of territorial governance that no longer carried the constant undercurrent of danger that had once defined nearly every conversation within these walls. Peace, genuine and hard-won, had settled over the Ashgrove territory at last, and Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply exist within a moment, without watching for the next threat lurking at its edges. Damien found her there as the sun began to set, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin against the top of her head, a familiar gesture that had become one of Elena's favorite quiet comforts over the past year. "You are thinking too hard again," he murmured against her hair. "I can always tell." "I was thinking about how far we have come," Elena said, leaning back into his embrace. "A year ago, I collapsed at the edge of a ceremony crowd, certain my life would never amount to anything more than survival. Now I am queen of this territory, a peacemaker between kingdoms, standing beside a man I have grown to love more deeply than I ever imagined possible. It still feels almost unbelievable, even now. Fate has a strange sense of timing," Damien said softly, "but I have stopped questioning its wisdom. It gave me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it most, even though neither of us understood that at the time." Elena turned in his arms to face him fully, the last light of the setting sun casting warm gold across his features, and felt the familiar, steady pulse of the bond that had first awakened between them the night she collapsed into his arms as a frightened stranger. What had once felt overwhelming and impossible now felt simply like home, a certainty woven into the very foundation of who she had become. "Whatever comes next," she said quietly, "I am glad it comes with you beside me." "Always," Damien said, and sealed the promise with a kiss beneath the fading light. Two lives forever changed by a single collapse, at a ceremony neither of them would ever forget, now bound together not merely by fate, but by a love they had built deliberately, courageously, through every trial that had tested them along the way. The territory beneath them settled into a quiet evening, safe and prosperous, ruled by a king who had learned the true meaning of trust, and a queen who had transformed from an overlooked Omega into the very heart of a kingdom's strength. Her story no longer one of quiet survival, but of a life fully and rightfully claimed as her own.